Hello, Commander. My apologies that we couldn't meet in person. I'll be your space warfare advisor. I'll try to keep things simple. I get that you're a politician and not a spacer. Speaking of which, thanks to your efforts throughout the 2020s, the Resistance has secured a strong foothold both planetside and in space. I strongly suggest that since we're entering the 2030s, that we begin building up a proper space force so that we may someday defeat our enemies, alien and otherwise, in the vacuum of space. I'm here today to explain the enemies that we'll be facing, and from there we'll talk about the fundamentals of starship design, in the context of combating both the Traitor and the Xeno. This is our enemy, the Xenos that we've come to know as Hydras. While their technology is as alien as their biology, spectral readings seem to suggest antimatter-catalyzed fusion torch engines, which are enormously efficient. While they pack enormous amounts of delta V, probably in the hundreds of kilometers a second, we think their maximum acceleration potential is somewhat moderate, at just 2 to 3 Gs or so, aside from their smallest ships. This is equivalent or even less than some of our modern chemical rockets. To make up for this shortcoming, their armor appears to be a kind of diamond nanothread weaving, augmented with exotic nanotechnology to further enhance its already formidable strength. We also know from prior space engagements that the Hydras rely heavily on energy weapons, like lasers, particle beams, and toroidal plasma cannons, but occasionally field advanced coil guns, or even missiles. While this technological disparity can seem overwhelming, there are ways we can exploit their technology and tactics to use their preferred engagement methods in our favor. But to fight these Xenos, we'll need more than our little exo-fighters. The spacefaring warships that we build will be heavy and expensive, especially compared to our orbital stations. It's impractical to launch them, or even their components from Earth, so we'll need to set up mining bases in key locations across Luna, Mars, and the Belt to secure the resources we need to assemble the ships. We'll also need at least one orbital construction facility, perhaps in Earth orbit or at a Lagrange point near Luna. We'll also want to arm our construction facilities with at least one self-defense module. We wouldn't want a stray Xeno scoutcraft or hostile exofighter squadron erasing all of our hard work in one fell swoop. With a shipyard in place, we can start to design our first ships. I'll first go through all the potential ship classes that our engineers have thought up so far, and I'll briefly touch on the purpose of each one. The gunship is the smallest of our space warships, barely larger than an exofighter, and carrying the simplest of weapons, but they are very easy and cheap to build. The escort is armed with 2 hull mounts, ideal for missile strikes or point defense, but it lacks a spinal mount. The corvette is armed with the hull mount and a spinal mount, but also carries 3 utility modules. It serves best as a utility craft first and a warship second, carrying the facilities needed for things like boarding or in-situ refueling. A considerable size up from corvettes, the frigate carries a spinal mount and 2 hull mounts, and it carries an impressive suite of 5 utility modules, an all-round multi-role ship for the fleet that puts combat as a second priority. The Monitor is the escort's bigger brother, lacking a spinal mount, but carrying 4 hull mounts, perfect for missile carriers, point defense ships, or high-speed strike ships. And the Destroyer carries 2 nose mounts, for either a large spinal weapon or 2 smaller ones. And it also carries 2 hull mounts for point defense or backup armament. Another big step up in size, the Cruiser is a larger cousin to the frigate, with 7 utility modules to serve a multifunction role within a task force. Unlike the frigate, the Cruiser also carries a twin spinal mount and 3 hull mounts, meaning it's still quite capable in combat. The battle cruiser is practically built around its triple spinal mount, to mount a massive cannon, laser weapon, or similar. It also carries 2 hull mounts, which will likely just end up serving as point defense slots. And the battleship is a true monster in the void, mounting a twin spinal mount and a whopping 6 hull mounts, for turreted cannons, directed energy weapons, point defenses, or nigh endless banks of missiles. Larger still is the Lancer, which is like a scaled-up battlecruiser, built around a quadruple spinal mount, for mounting the largest weapons conceivable on a warship, like an antimatter particle cannon or a siege coil gun. At 275 meters long, the Dreadnought is perhaps the largest ship which we could conceivably mass-produce. Armed with a staggering 8 hull mounts and the same triple spinal mount as the battlecruiser, the Dreadnought can fill a battle space with enough weapons fire to rival a small strike force. Even a few of these sent towards the enemy could convince them to flip and burn the other way in a tactical retreat. And finally, the Titan is a largely conceptual ship which we see little practical applications for. Not for lack of capability, but rather the opposite. With the same quad spinal mount as the Lancer, but also boasting 6 hull mounts and 9 utility modules, the Titan is designed to achieve any single wartime strategic or tactical objective imaginable, from space combat to boarding operations and fleet command. Their enormous cost to produce, coupled with their impractically large size, means that we should probably construct a scarce few to fill the role of task force command ships, sitting at the center of our space action groups. Looking back through our lineup, we notice that there are 3 main types of ships. Ships which focus on powerful spinal weapons, which we'll call standoff ships. Ships which focus on turreted or missile weapons, which we'll call void superiority ships. And ships which focus on utility modules, which we'll call multi-role ships. Now I'll go through the different modules on a space warship. I'll explain what each one does and provide some practical advice for each one when designing your warships. The most complex component of a starship is its main drive. A warship's engines and their supporting infrastructure have been grouped into the drive system. It's what lets your ship travel from place to place. A warship must be able to match the orbit, close with, and destroy a target within a specified domain, be it Earth or interplanetary space, so its drive should reflect this objective. Essentially, there are 3 primary things to pay attention to when picking out your drive. The drive's thrust measures how hard the engine can push on your spacecraft, which determines your ship's maximum combat acceleration, key for evasion and pursuit. High thrust drives are great for combat ships. Acceleration is measured in milligis, each equal to 1/1000th of Earth gravity. In general, a combat ship should have at least a couple hundred milligis of maximum combat acceleration. Anything above 1g is considered decently speedy, and anything above 2g's is considered outright fast. But we'll need highly trained spacers or acceleration pharmaceuticals in order to maintain a sustained burn above 3g's. While thrust determines your acceleration, exhaust velocity determines your range. Think of exhaust velocity like a measure of your fuel efficiency. Higher exhaust velocity means a longer range for the same amount of fuel, and consequently, less resources spent to refuel for the same amount of distance. Exhaust velocity, paired with the amount of fuel you pack, combine to form your ship's delta V, the total amount a ship can change its velocity. The delta V of a ship should reflect a ship's purpose. An orbital defense ship for keeping Earth's skies clear can get away with between 5 and 10 kilometers per second of delta V, but going interplanetary in a wartime time frame will probably require more than 30 kilometers a second of delta V to be safe. But remember, bigger is only better if a ship needs to go the distance. Don't feel down if your ships only have 10 kilometers per second or so if all they need to do is defend Earth orbit. This chart paints a rough picture of the thrust and exhaust velocity potential of several different drive categories that we're looking into. We see that our standard chemical propellant drives have excellent thrust but poor exhaust velocity, meaning they'll have short ranges. Fission drives have improved range, but usually worse thrust, with a few exceptions. Both the exhaust velocity and thrust of fission drives improves as engine technology advances from solid core to molten core to gas core. Fusion drives are orders of magnitude more efficient than fission drives, but will require massive investments into research to obtain. And they'll require enormous, heavy radiators to keep the engine cool, impairing their efficiency by a decent amount. A drive's fuel type is also important. Our spaceships will eventually need to refuel. Most drives use hydrogen, oxygen, and sometimes other trace volatile chemicals or fissiles as fuel. All of this is fairly easy to locate and mine throughout the solar system. However, certain drives, like the NSWR, uses enormous amounts of fissile materials as the fuel directly, which may be difficult to mine in such large quantities. Consider a drive's fuel type and plan infrastructure accordingly so that we don't overstress our mining infrastructure. We can also, of course, mess with the amount of fuel that a ship can carry. We add fuel tanks. Each fuel tank holds 10 units or 100 tons of fuel. Smaller escorts might carry less than 20 fuel tanks, while larger capital ships might carry over 100. More fuel grants more range, but also worsens a ship in terms of agility, and most importantly, each fuel tank offers diminishing returns over the last. because the ship must now lug around all that additional fuel. Don't get carried away and make 90% of your ship's mass fuel. Keep that ratio about a cool 25 to 50% for balanced range and acceleration characteristics. In summary, thrust is how fast you can go, exhaust velocity is how far you can go, and fuel tanks offer diminishing returns. The hard part's over, we've built our engine, now let's talk about how to power it. To power a starship and its weapons, we'll need a power supply. Power supplies come in many types, but the most common are nuclear reactors of one type or another. A ship's drive may actually require a ship to use a certain reactor type. For example, a gas core fission lantern will not function without the appropriate gas core fission reactor to run the fuel through. So just slide the appropriate reactor into the housing and you're good to go. Once the engines are powered, consider that the excess power of the reactor is going into powering weapons, so keep that in mind and plan accordingly, especially when you're using power-hungry weapons like lasers, railguns, or particle beams, as some drives eat up a lot of power. As we research more advanced power supplies of the same class, the maximum amount of power output increases, while the weight of the power supply decreases. So a more advanced reactor often allows both more power-hungry systems and a lower mass for better acceleration and maneuvering characteristics. Now let's talk about heat dissipation. We use radiators to get rid of the excess heat from the drive, reactor, weapon systems, and incoming enemy attacks. In space, where there's no convection or conduction, ejecting waste heat through pure radiation is a long, annoying process, so radiators must be built quite large. On top of that, radiators are often delicate, and if an enemy shoots them off, you're almost instantly rendered combat ineffective, as firing the drive or the weapons might overheat the electrical systems of the whole ship. So we'll either want to develop radiators that are less prone to damage, or retract them before entering combat, which will require an onboard internal heatsink, or both. We already know how to make aluminum and titanium fin radiators, like those on our space stations, but those are both heavy and vulnerable in combat. We should be able to develop carbon nanotube filament radiators, which are a lot tougher, and eventually magnetic dust or droplet radiators that are both more efficient and harder for the enemy to hit. Now let's talk components. We can install all sorts of additional components within the hull of the ship to further improve our capabilities. For example, if we install heat sinks in our ship, which collect and store the ship's waste heat, we can retract our delicate radiators during combat for a short time, keeping them safe from enemy attacks so long as the heatsink doesn't overload. Some other important components include electronic warfare suites for jamming enemy targeting computers, power cells to store and feed power to energy weapons, extra ammunition for guns and missiles, or even marine boarding teams to seize enemy space assets. A popular choice for warships is critical component armoring, which makes critical components of the ship significantly harder to destroy even after the external armor has been pierced. There's far too many components for me to go through individually, so I'll leave it to you to go through them and toss in whatever you think is best. Multi-role ships, like frigates and cruisers, can fit abnormally large amounts of components relative to their size, so it's good to have them serve double duty as troop ships, in-situ mining vessels, or colony carriers. Next up, to protect our ship from damage, we'll need armor. We've grouped a warship's armor into 3 categories: frontal, side, and rear. Frontal armor is arguably the most important, since your ship will be facing the enemy for most of an engagement, assuming everything goes according to plan. So unless you got a specific reason to do otherwise, be sure to give the nose of your ship the heaviest armor. Side armor protects the ship's flanks, making it by far the heaviest of the armor categories. Some side armor is always a decent idea to protect against flanking enemy craft, but even moderately thick side armor will give you mobility problems very quickly. Rear armor is useful to protect a ship's engines and reactor from flanking attacks that may have slipped through your defensive screen, but its importance is far outweighed by frontal armor. We've tried to make armor protection simple with armor points, with each point representing a level of relative protection. A ship equipped with 10 points of steel armor, for example, will have roughly the same level of protection as one with 10 points of largely theoretical diamondoid armor. The main difference is the thickness, and thus weight and material cost. In space, we'll want the lightest armor possible for the same level of protection, so while we'll start with our usual steel, titanium, and boron carbide, we can probably research our way up to carbon nanotube armor and eventually diamondoid armor. In terms of armor points, here's a rough chart of some nose armor values and their strengths. Armor is especially effective against laser weapons, which can be almost entirely defeated with thick enough armor plating. Speaking of which, it's finally time to talk about the fun stuff, weapons to defeat the enemy. We've grouped our space warfare weapons into two categories, kinetic weapons and directed energy weapons, each with several subsections. Let's go through each of them, starting from what you're probably most familiar with to what you're probably least familiar with. Aside from missiles, all weapon types can be mounted either in a ship's forward mounts for higher firepower, or along a ship's hull for a full 360-degree firing arc. Guns are nearly useless in space, as the shells fly slowly and are easily intercepted, with one notable exception. The 40mm point defense cannon, or PDC, which we've exclusively designed for space warfare, can be used to defend warships from incoming projectiles, and it's especially effective against enemy coil gun rounds, a type of kinetic weapon which we'll cover later. It's tricky for a point defense laser to melt a tungsten kinetic round, but trivial for a point defense cannon to knock it off course. Any ship that you don't want dying to enemy railgun or coil gun fire should have at least one point defense cannon. It's also not half bad in close-range ship-to-ship engagements, thanks to its high volume of fire and moderate weight of shot. Missiles offer the most destructive potential of any spacecraft weapon system. Even a single hit can deal cataclysmic damage to an enemy ship. There are two types of missiles: regular missiles with lower fuel but more ammo capacity, and torpedoes with much more fuel, enabling a far faster, longer-ranged approach, but with lower ammo capacity. Both are flexible enough to be fitted on even small escort-class ships, and can allow a small ship to punch well above its weight class. A swarm of small spacecraft armed with missiles have one shot at defeating entire enemy fleets before they run out of ammo, and they can alter their course mid-flight, compensating for enemy evasive maneuvers. However, they're extremely vulnerable to the enemy point defenses, especially the directed energy point defenses used by the Hydra, and their ammunition capacity is punishingly small, making them somewhat suboptimal against Xeno fleets. They should be employed in large numbers to saturate enemy point defenses or in conjunction with other kinetic weapons. However, they should be especially effective against human ships, traitors and alike, who lack the advanced point defense technology of the Xenos. Eventually, we may be able to fit them with nuclear shape charges or antimatter payloads, allowing them to deal enormous damage without even needing to score a direct hit. Overall, however, missiles are heavily constrained by their vulnerability to point defenses and their low ammunition capacity, so we recommend that once we research superior weaponry, we should probably move away from using missiles. They'll serve their purpose as a low-tech solution to big problems. Magnetic weapons use electromagnetic rails or coils to fling tungsten sabots at very high speed, much faster than regular cannon rounds. Magnetic weapons include both railguns and coil guns, though we believe railguns should be far easier and faster to research than the higher quality coil guns. While they deal less damage and travel slower than missiles, a ship can carry hundreds or even thousands of sabots in their magazine, compared to just a few missiles for the same amount of space. Even so, even a short barrage from a railgun battery can turn an enemy ship into a depressurized hulk. They're also much harder to shoot down with energy weapons than missiles, and can be used to densely populate the battle space with obstacles that the enemy fleet must avoid. Avoiding a single railgun sabot is trivial, but avoiding 100, each one predicting your lead, is a lot more annoying, especially if you're a lumbering capital ship. If you know the enemy is bringing decent-sized ships to the fight, magnetic weapons are your go-to solution. Electromagnetic weapons can easily serve as the primary weapon of large battle lines, the bread and butter of your fleets. While they'll struggle to score hits on faster-moving flanker ships, they'll at least give these ships a much harder time outflanking and approaching your fleet, forcing them to constantly change their speed and heading to avoid the barrage, or using their main weapons as point defenses, preventing them from firing on you with them. Now let's move on to directed energy weapons. Laser weapons will hit just about every shot they take, and offer the fastest response time of any weapon system, making them ideal against higher speed enemy combatants. In space, where heat dissipation is a bit tricky, lasers can overheat and destroy an enemy ship by burning through vital systems and slicing off radiators. Eventually, we can develop arc lasers or phased array lasers in order to improve the laser's rate of fire. We can also look into researching different laser wavelengths, like visible light or ultraviolet for higher armor penetration. Lasers can also double as point defenses in a pinch, and we can develop dedicated laser point defense systems too. However, a laser's damage falls off rapidly at range, and even small amounts of armor can almost completely nullify a laser's damaging effects. Powerful spinal-mounted lasers can be used to negate this, but of course, this means building larger ships and keeping the nose of these ships pointed at the enemy. But lasers are excellent for swatting fast movers that try to outflank your fleets, or when fired in great volleys against single targets. Particle weapons fire beams of charged particles at their targets, disabling electronic systems and frying crew members. You can think of them like huge stun guns. They have shorter range than lasers and deal less damage per shot, but they can be fired many times in quick succession without overheating, whereas lasers can only be fired once before a somewhat lengthy cooldown. They also care much less about an enemy ship's armor thickness than lasers. Many ships equipped with particle beams all accelerating towards a target in formation can create a deadly particle beam net, where all ships fire into a target at once, zapping it into oblivion in a matter of seconds. While normal particle beams do suffer from low physical damage, a potential solution to this is on the horizon. Theoretically, a particle cannon could focus a tiny quantity of antimatter into the beam, blasting through enemy armor and dealing massive thermal damage to its target. But if we go with this approach, do keep in mind that we'll need a small orbital antimatter production facility in order to manufacture such weapons, unless we can somehow find antimatter elsewhere. And lastly, plasma weapons. Plasma weapons fire self-contained plasma toroids at their target, with an extremely high muzzle velocity, far exceeding that of electromagnetic weapons. Like a massive thermite grenade, the toroid bursts on contact with its target, melting away the target's armor plating. However, its damage against the actual guts of a target is relatively limited, since plasma splashes over the target indiscriminately rather than boring down into a weak spot. Due to the immense heat that these weapons build up, however, their rate of fire will be limited, as it'll take time for the weapon to cool down after firing, even with the radiators extended. Now that we understand our potential weapon systems, let's go over a few combinations and strategies that have worked well in simulations. In the very near future, we may be forced to defend our orbital assets from enemy attacks with relatively limited technology. This is where the mosquito swarm strategy comes in handy. With a decent number of escort or monitor class ships armed to the teeth with missiles or torpedoes, we can saturate enemy point defense grids with sheer volume of fire. We can use this strategy to theoretically wipe out large portions of an attacking fleet in a very short time frame. This is a bit of a risky strategy, as if the enemy is still alive once our magazines have been emptied, there's very little we can do to stop them from there. Eventually, with the right technology, we'll be able to throw some railguns or other EM weaponry into the mix to give enemy PD even more to think about. On the topic of railguns and other EM weapons, a fleet can be perfectly capable by almost exclusively using railguns or other electromagnetic weapons. You might think the enemy could simply outrange you with their laser weapons. Well, that's true, but consider this. If our fleet is firing several railgun shots per second, which are tricky to burn out with point defense lasers, the enemy will have to dedicate their primary directed energy weapons to point defense duty as well to avoid destruction. So a mixture of spinal and turreted railguns can fill a battle space with enough projectiles to pierce through the thickest of PD envelopes, and eliminate even the largest of enemy warships with ease. Throw a few lasers into the mix to swap down flankers, and we have a fleet that's ready for just about any situation. Deep space fleets may have to operate far from their home ports for extended periods, so until we establish outer systems infrastructure, we might find benefits in deep space fleets which require no ammunition at all. I don't think I need to explain why we wouldn't want our fleet to run out of ammo while deep in space far from a home port. To defeat enemy armor and eliminate enemy ships without kinetic weapons, we'll have to get creative with a combination of plasma cannons and laser weapons. Plasma melts off armor from our target ship, opening them up to attacks from laser weapons or antimatter particle cannons. This combination allows a fleet to inflict vicious damage on an enemy fleet without ever needing to rearm. It's best to use a few models of standoff ships armed with spinally mounted energy weapons, some plasma, some laser, for the greatest effect on target. Hull-mounted turrets can be decent for electromagnetic weapons, but for directed energy weapons, their destructive power becomes severely constrained by the complexity of integrating such technologies into a turret system. Before we wrap up, I'd like to briefly talk about fleet doctrine. In other words, which ships to put into a fleet to take advantage of their individual specializations. We'll first build a few sponge ships, void superiority ships with heavy armor and thick point defenses, meant to accelerate ahead of the main force and absorb the fire of the enemy while the rest of the fleet opens up with their main guns unimpeded. Speaking of which, the main force is comprised of some standoff ships using their spinal mounts to focus down the enemy. There's also a few more void superiority ships in the mix. They're hull-mounted turrets for both layered point defense and for swatting down hostile flanking ships so that the main force can concentrate their fire on the enemy battle line itself. At the rear of the formation are some scarce utility craft, meant for boarding, salvage, or construction, and of course the fleet's flagship, with the bridge for flag officers to make commanding the fleet a bit easier on our mission control. While some ships may be faster than others, all ships have around the same amount of delta V, and move at about the same speed. A fleet can only go as far and as fast as its slowest, least capable ship. A versatile fleet like this can handle just about any situation with equal competency. And lastly, I'd like to give you some general tips on how to strategize during space combat. Firstly, try not to rush into things unless your fleet is built for that. Every burn you make towards the enemy will keep you drifting towards them at that speed until you flip and burn to decelerate, exposing your more vulnerable tail section. So take it slow and don't overshoot the enemy unless your fleet demands high acceleration for hit and run tactics. Keep your ships decently spaced out, but not so far that they can't support each other. Close, but not too tight. A fleet that's too closely bunched together might activate their emergency collision avoidance system, which can really mess with your fleet's formation and maneuvering capacity. You may want to padlock your ships to their targets to keep their nose angled towards their enemies, which is especially helpful for standoff ships taking out flankers. It may also be in your interest to focus down designated priority targets quickly, so use the fleet command tools to designate high-value targets for the fleet to zap into oblivion. And lastly, don't be afraid to let your enemies make the first moves so that you can respond accordingly. See if they deploy flankers, or charge straight at you, or do whatever's on their mind. Then compensate accordingly, position your forces to meet theirs while their forces are committed, and scratch their icons off the plot one by one. That just about wraps it up for me. I know it's a lot to take in. If there's a few key takeaways from today, it's this. Before building fleets and ships, make sure to have an objective for the ships in mind. Then make sure your ships have the delta V to accomplish this objective. Building onto this, pack enough fuel, but not too much, since you'll see diminishing returns. Mount the heaviest armor on the nose, with lighter armor on the sides and rear to save weight. If you expect kinetic weapons, make sure your ships have appropriate point defenses to keep themselves safe. And make sure your weapon choices on your ships and across the fleet complement each other. And once that's done, bolt on the modules that best benefit the role of a ship. Let's get our ships built and put some fleets out into space, Commander. We got some serious work to do.